Now we are going to implement our compute layer, and for that we will create another private method called create compute. And here we are going to create all the Lambda functions that we need. So first, we would be passing the same props to each function that we are going to create. So I'm going to create a variable here that I'm just gonna reuse for Node.js function props. Obviously, we would need the AWS SDK in our Lambda function, so we are specifying it as an external module here. And then we also are going to pass an environment variable for the table name, just to make the code more generic. Actually, I used it somewhere else as well. I'm just gonna create a constant for that. So define it at the top. And when I created my persistence layer, there I use this value. So I'm just gonna use this constant instead. And one final thing which we need to specify in the props for the function is the runtime, which is going to be Node.js. Actually, let me just import all right. This should be good. Now we are going to create our first Lambda function, which we're going to use with the post API method, and it would be responsible for creating a new order. We're calling it create order Lambda. It's a Node.js function. And actually, I should have created the file earlier. So I'm going to create a folder called Lambdas. And then within this folder, I'm going to have a file for each Lambda function. So for create order, I'm going to say create order.ts. And this is the entry point file that I need to specify here. So I need to prepend the directory name as well. So for that, I'm going to use dir name and the directory under which I'm storing the file, and then the file name. And then the function props, just kind of flatten here. And obviously I need to define create order Lambda as a member variable. Now this function would need read and write access to the DynamoDB table that we created earlier. So for that, there is a very easy helper routine that we can use on the DynamoDB table object. So we're going to say orders table dot grant read write data to this Lambda function. So now this Lambda function is going to have read write access to the data inside the DynamoDB table. Let's now implement the create order Lambda function. So this is just boilerplate stuff for implementing any Lambda function. So I'm gonna grab the table name here. It's coming in as an environment variable, so gonna pull it from the environment. And right now I'm just gonna add a simple print here. Just return a success status. That's all that should be required to create this simple Lambda function. So let's go and deploy. I'm just combining the two commands together. Let's go and check the Lambda function, whether it got created. Should have gotten created since the deployment completed successfully. No, actually it won't get completed because we haven't called that function in our code. So let's do that first. Create persistence and then create compute. All right. And re-execute that same command again and wait for it to complete. The build failed with this error, and I actually haven't really looked into this in detail, but when I do this, when I add ESBuild as a dev dependency, then it succeeds. And this happens when you create a Lambda function. That's when this issue shows up. So if the same issue shows up for you, install this dev dependency and that should fix it. Now it's gotten to the part where it's doing the deployment. The deployment completed. Now, like always, we will go to the console and look at the new resource that got created, which is the Lambda function in this case. So we'll go to the CloudFormation stack associated with this deployment. And if we go to resources, we're going to see this new resource, create order, which is a Lambda function. And this is where it is. Now, obviously, we are anxious to see our new Lambda function in action, but in order to invoke it, we need to create a REST API. But before we do that, let's just create the other two Lambda functions so that we can sort of complete the compute creation part of our infrastructure. So following the same pattern, we will create a file for each Lambda function. So if you recall the REST API methods that we were going to support. So one was post, which is going to get supported by create order. Then the other was put for the update. And then the third one was get orders. So we are going to create a Lambda function for each of the API method. So to get orders, we're going to say get orders. And for update order, the put operation, we're going to say update order. And we are also going to add the boilerplate code to these. Okay, let's go back to the CDK code and create these two Lambda functions. So copy and paste. Let's create the third member variable as well while we are here, which will be update order. Actually, for get orders, we don't need to grant write. We just need to grant read data access. So follow the principle of least privilege access here. Now we're gonna deploy. Changes got deployed. Let's quickly go to the console and see the new Lambda functions. So go back to CloudFormation, stack, refresh. Now we are seeing these two additional Lambda functions that we just created. Now we will go ahead and create the REST API. And then after that, we should be able to invoke our code through the REST API methods. So just like with the other layers of our infrastructure, we are going to create a separate method for the REST API. The REST API is going to be an API gateway. And for that, a CDK provides us this class called REST API. And that is what we are going to instantiate here. We're gonna let's just call it shop API. This is where we are supposed to provide the API name. Now, if you remember the presentation, these are the API methods that we need to support. So first is going to be, and the other is going to be the put call. And the third one is the get. So first we will create a resource within our API root, and we just say add resource, and the resource name is orders. And then we add the desired paths to this resource. So it's a Lambda integration. For that, CDK provides the Lambda integration class that we can use, and this is going to point to the create order Lambda. So that's what we are specifying here. And let's go ahead and add the other two resources as well. So this is going to be for put, and for get as well. Actually, for put, we haven't taken care of this part, right? So let's do that. So within the orders resource, we are going to add another resource, which is going to represent the order ID. And that's how you can specify path parameter with the curly braces. And then this add method call is for the single order resource. And this is fine. This actually, just to get the sequence and hierarchy better organized, I'm gonna basically handle the orders resource first, and after that the resources that come after orders. And lastly, we need to call this method in the constructor. Let's deploy our stack now. Let's now go to AWS console and see our REST API, the API gateway that got created, and also the API methods that got linked with our Lambda functions. Refresh. Here we see the shop API, and let's check out the API gateway console. So here's our API. These are our API methods. If you go to get, you will see that it is linked to the get orders. Similarly, you'll see the same on the post. Should be linked to create orders, and this should be linked to update order. Okay. So at this point, we have created the API. We have the Lambda functions that are going to get executed behind the API. They just have boilerplate code, but the functions are there. So let's go ahead and invoke one of our API methods and see what happens. So very quick overview of the Postman setup that we would be using. I have defined a couple of variables. One is for the host, and then the other is for the token, which I'm gonna go over very soon when we're gonna talk about authorization. But right now, we just want to focus on host. And host is the API gateway endpoint that we need to hit in order to invoke our API. This endpoint gets emitted whenever we do the deployment. So I'm going to get it from here and update. And then I have a tab for each of our API method. And here I'm using the host variable. And this is the body for the request. This is not being used right now. We're just gonna invoke this API method and see what happens. Yeah, as expected, I got the 201 success status because we are not doing anything and just returning the success status. So far so good. Let's go to back to our console, look at the CloudWatch logs for the Lambda function and see if anything got outputted in the logs, because we have a console.log statement. So let's do that. Actually, I already have this tab opened for this function. So if I go to monitor, and then from here, I can just go directly to the CloudWatch logs. And we're going to select the latest log stream. And here we are seeing the Lambda function invocation and also our debug message that we printed out. And here we are also seeing the table name that is being passed as an environment variable. So all good up till this point.